Hey guys, I'm Ben. I work for SeatGeek as introed. I'm here to talk about retention. I don't think that's been talked about very much at all yet. I'm taking Lightning Keynote to mean that it will be fast, but not necessarily that my insight will be electrifying, so hang on. Let's get started. So the title of my presentation is last but not least, retention marketing. Quick history about me. I've been at SeatGeek for almost 5 years, from when we were 10-person like Series A business. We're now over 100 people. It's changed a lot in the course of that time. I was the first marketing hire, and for most of my career there, I've been an acquisition marketer. But within the last year, I've started focusing on retention, like pretty actively. I've been trying as hard as possible to forget all of my acquisition life, focus on retention. And so the gist of this presentation is try to convey some of the some of the questions that I've wrestled with as I've sort of switched gears into retention, and maybe that'll be applicable to other folks in the room. I'll start with the most obvious thing, right? So retention is naturally a second order function. If you haven't at least acquired one user, you cannot possibly retain them. So it's natural for people to start with acquisition and move into retention over time. I do think that I certainly fell victim to this, being an acquisition marketer, knowing that there was value in attempting to retain our customers better, but always being sucked into the short-term sort of appeal of acquisition marketing. So we probably waited too long to get into retention. I think it's a tempting mistake to make. And that begs the question, why bother with retention, I guess? I started with the most obvious insight. This is probably the most generic insight I can make. SeatGeek is like a sort of e-commerce-y business, so maybe some of the things I say later are less applicable to the rest of you guys. This is the source of, it's from a Harvard Business Review study. They took a retrospective look at M&A data from 2003 to 2013, so businesses with acquisition data on the public record, and looked at the value of all those acquisitions and basically high-level categories of the enterprise value in the transaction. And I thought it was pretty interesting here. Basically, it highlights sort of two trends that I've seen in my arc at SeatGeek, which is going from a small startup to a later stage startup. There's sort of two tendencies. One is the one we're talking about, which is acquisition into retention and sort of increasing customer value, which I guess is the blue line in this chart. And then the other one is moving from very strict DR channels into branding channels. And that seems like the things that a lot of people are more inclined to lean into. They feel like they've maxed out DR. They want to lean into brand as their next focus. And they're not mutually exclusive, and we do both of them at SeatGeek now at this phase. But I think that this chart was illuminating for me in that it seems like the public market for businesses is valuing brand less and less. And I think part of the reason we're at this conference is everything is very measurable now. And so the value of customers can be measured and is knowable and is a bigger part of enterprise value. And so generically, I think it's safe to say we're all here to maximize enterprise value. I'm going to make the case that retention marketing is a better way to do that. And so a simplistic way of thinking about this would be this, right? So you have some number of users. If you retain them better, they're worth more. That hits your bottom line. You have more dollars, which is good. And that makes sense if you're sort of a profit maximizing business. SeatGeek isn't. And so one of the things that I think about, it gets me more excited about getting up and working on retention and just feels a little bit more practically applicable to us, is I think about it as sort of a wheel, right? So you have some number of users. Those users are worth some amount of money, like marginal value. And that usually is at least a major informant of how much you can afford to pay to acquire those users. And then once you know what your sort of break-even cost for acquiring a user is, that informs basically what your reach is. You're subject to the same sort of media availability as the rest of the world. You bid, you get your however many impressions you're entitled to. Those are your acquired users. And so one of the things I think about with retention is if you can increase lifetime value, then we can increase the basically the break-even marginal cost of acquiring a new user. In other words, our bids, we can raise our bids. And I think my experience being an acquisition marketer, I think there's a lot of you guys in the room, is if you can increase your bids, like say we increase the lifetime value of our user by like 20%. If I can also increase my like CPM or CPI target on Facebook by 20%, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm only getting 20% more reach. You can actually like unlock new channels or unlock new pockets of inventory, which gets exciting because then that feeds back into the wheel, and now you're acquiring users faster and you're making them worth more. And so, sort of like as I was introed, I think that there's a reverse way of looking at this, which is that through retaining users, you can actually like impact positively your growth. So that's what I get excited about with retention. So that begs the question, what actually do I mean by retention? This is a non-comprehensive way I think of retention organizationally. So I think of 3 big buckets. There's messaging. I highlighted that in blue because I'm going to talk about email and push specifically. There's like the whole aspect of like product marketing and how that informs retention. A couple of subcategories under there. I'm not going to go into that at all because 15 minutes, and I think there's like a cartoon shepherd's hook that's going to yank me off stage if I don't keep to the time. And then third, infrastructure. So I'll talk a little bit about analytics and attribution. Seems befitting of the locale here. But yeah, to start with, I want to talk about messaging, email, and push first. So I took a look at some of the data from SeatGeek. These are all sort of rounded numbers, but one of the things about retention messaging is it's really cheap. And you hear that a lot, that like it costs a lot less to retain a customer than to acquire a customer. So it's not surprising to see this, but it's so much cheaper. Our CPMs on email or push are less than $1, which is 10 times cheaper than what we pay for our Facebook newsfeed ads, and 70 times cheaper than a Times Square billboard, which we are running right now. So next time you're in Times Square, in the next couple of weeks, look out for our billboard. So yeah, it's cheap, which is great. The other thing is, one of the questions I faced going into it is, we're starting essentially from square zero. What do I focus on first? Is it messaging? Is it product? We decided messaging was probably the easiest thing for us to make the fastest changes on. And so we had to decide email or push. And we have a web business, we have a mobile app business. They're sort of equivalently valuable to us. So that wasn't obvious to choose. We ended up going with a big focus on email first. And one of the big reasons is, and I don't think people think about this as much as they probably should, it's mostly mobile anyway. So when we send an email, like 7 out of 10 devices that open it are mobile apps. And so we're reaching mostly the same people we would have reached with push notifications. Our opt-in rates on push conceivably we're reaching more people on mobile devices. And so we think about email as, email and push is not a desktop web versus mobile dichotomy, but we think about email as just a way to reach across the board. The other thing about email is it's so much richer than push. I'm not proud enough of my SeatGeek emails that I wanted to show them here, but I think Nike does a really great job. And so this email is beautiful. I don't need these shoes, but I would spend some time looking at this email. Compare that to a push notification, right? The equivalent push notification, it doesn't convey nearly the same thing. You can have a whole experience when people tap and launch the app, and it can work, but I think that people are so accustomed to email and having a natural, everyone has their own process for going through it. It's a very natural way to reach people, and it's just so much richer. So I think email is powerful for that reason. And this sort of, having arrived at this decision, we are going to focus on email. One of our big concerns was, because we care about our user experience a lot, is how annoying is email? Like, if we send a lot of email, at what point do people just unsubscribe? What point do we actually do damage to our brand? And so this was I took a look back for the last 18 months or something. At June last year, basically, was when we started thinking about retention and started sort of scaling up our retention efforts. And I don't know why my arrows aiming a little bit bad, but from June 16 to June 17, we basically 6x the amount of retention messages we've sent, so email and push per month, which is not intrinsically a thing to be proud of, but we were, at each step along the way, we were sort of like more skittish about, like, is it okay for us to send, this month, can we afford to send 20% more email than we sent last month? And the thing I've been surprised by is I don't think we found a ceiling. I don't want to stand up here and say that everybody should spam all their customers, but it seems to work. So over the course of this time, we've 6x the amount of email we've sent. There's definitely diminishing marginal returns. We've, I think, 3x'd the amount of revenue from email. So for every extra 2 emails we've sent, we've got like 1 extra purchase, which is a trade-off that I'm still willing to take. So I think one of the things that I've been surprised by when I wanted to share was just that it's not really clear to me yet how much email is too much email. And I care about user experience as much as anyone else, but it just makes sense. And so the last thing I want to talk about outside of the messaging aspect is some of the things that we've started thinking about at SeatGeek for attributing retention marketing. And there's I think retargeted advertising is a whole other layer of complexity, which I'm not going to talk about at all. But when you go into retention marketing, your first, the most naive thing you can do, right, is just your direct attribution. So if you send an email, someone clicks the email, they make a purchase, or they install an app from there, you have a record of that, and you say that email takes credit for that. That is, especially because retention is a second-order function, it can be pretty greedy, and you can actually be stealing from your acquisition channels, which, as we said, are more expensive. So you hate to sort of devalue them in an ROAS sense. So direct attribution is pretty naive when it comes to attributing retention channels. So the next thing you might consider doing is some kind of view through. So this would be like, we know who all our customers are before we contact them by retention messaging. So we know when we send them a message. Depending on a retargeting partner, we might know exactly when they were impressed with an ad impression. And so we can look at the timestamps and say, like, if they received and/or opened an email and then made a purchase within some window within that amount of time, we can attribute credit back to retention messaging. And so this actually just makes the retention channels greedier. I think there's some natural logic in this, in that, like, I see subject lines in my email inbox a lot, and that might remind me of something, an action I take later without interacting with the email. So I think there's legitimate value to be claimed through view-through attribution, but it just makes retention channels greedier, which is sort of the opposite of the problem I'm trying to solve. So one of the things I've been working on now is sort of a more systematic way of holding out our retention marketing programs. So I think a lot of people are accustomed to doing this in retargeting. You might run a holdout test or like a PSA test with your retargeting ads, where like half of my ads advertise SeatGeek and half of them advertise like Smokey the Bear, and by whatever proportion the SeatGeek ads outperform the Smokey the Bear ads, that's my like actual incrementality of the channel. When it comes to retention messaging channels, I think you can do something similar. And so basically what we're working on now is whenever we opt a new user into our retention messaging streams, whether it's email or push, we're assigning them into buckets, basically. And a small percentage of people are held out universally from the whole program. So we can easily, at any point in time, take a look and say, the 1% of users who never get anything from us, what are they worth? And then the other 99%, what are they worth? And then look at the gap and try to understand that. You can also do that on a campaign-by-campaign level with email. So we could have sort of different segments of our audience and have, for a given campaign, forgetting about the universal holdout, just hold out some other extra bit. And that could be true for like a life cycle program. So I think there's a whole rich way of sort of keeping your retention returns in check, and hopefully not detracting so much from the credit you would attribute to your acquisition channels through this holdout program, which again, it's not something I hear people talk about a lot, but as we've sort of started to get more sophisticated in our retention marketing. It's something that we're excited about so that we have a clearer picture of what we're doing. All right, and I think that's pretty much it. So just a recap of what I said. When to focus on retention, it's really never too early. As long as you have any quantity of users, there's value, I think, in working to retain them and maximize the value you have. Why? It's super cheap, right? It's way cheaper than all the acquisition channels. It creates enterprise value, as the chart I showed from Harvard Business Review, and it unlocks new growth, so that sort of wheel that we talked about. And then talked about email or push. I'm sort of doing this to take a position that might be a little bit contrary, but I think email is regarded as a pretty unsexy channel. I think is unfairly so. So I think people should spend more time thinking about email, even if you don't have a big web business. If you're a mobile app, I think there's value in email with deep linking. It can be like pretty much just as integrated as an experience as a push notification. How many messages is too many? Again, sort of a controversial position, but objectively, based on my experience in the last year, I've been surprised by how much ceiling room there is, or headroom, or how many messages we can send. People will not only tolerate, but interact with and convert on. And then how to assign how to assign credit. The naive way, direct. Everybody's already doing that for sure. View through can help, can give you more interesting information if you're struggling to make ends meet on your retention messaging campaigns for some reason. View through is a way to assign them a little extra credit. But then the thing I'm really excited about is holdout programs. So I'm a minute and a half over, but and I know I speak really fast and I'm sort of like borderline autistic, but hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Thank you so much.